Hello, and welcome to the Granite Bay Hilltop Seventh-day Adventist Church right here in Sacramento, California. And I'd like to welcome all of you here to the Amazing Health Expo 2023. And now we have our third speaker, Dr. Daniel Binus. Dr. Daniel Binus is a graduate of the Loma Linda University School of Medicine, and he graduated in psychiatry. And there, when he spent his time in Loma Linda, he became fascinated with the beauty of the mind. So ironically, he is the founder and clinical director of his own medical clinic called Beautiful Minds Medical. Dr. Binus believes in whole person care, and his passion is to understand the emotional, the physical, and the spiritual factors that influence each patient's well-being and to treat the cause of mental illness and not just the symptoms. So I think you are aware that today mental health illness is on an all-time high, especially after the pandemic. And we're very fortunate to have Dr. Binus here to talk about how to brace your brain for crisis. So please help me welcome up Dr. Daniel Binus.
Thank you so much, Darren. It's always a blessing to be with people that are interested in hearing about mental health. And I think today's topic is going to be one that is very relevant to the broader world because we are facing a lot of crises in this world today. And so we're going to be talking about some of the principles that we can practice day to day to better understand how we can deal with these crises that we are facing in the world today. All right, so I wanted to start by just sharing, if you want more information on mental health, on holistic mental health, I wanted to invite you to visit our website, beautifulmindshealth.com, beautifulmindshealth.com, and you can also stop by our booth. We have a booth in the exhibit hall where you can get more information. And you can also listen to our podcast, the Brain People podcast. So this is a podcast that I and three of my coworkers, two of them are psychotherapists, Dr. Katie Cruz, and who some of you might be familiar with. She's the wife of one of the pastors here at Granite Bay Seventh-day Adventist Church. And then Amanda Anguish, and then my colleague who's a psychiatric physician assistant, his name is Jonathan Eden. So we have a lot of fun talking about different mental health topics from a holistic perspective. So if you enjoy podcasting, check out the Brain People podcast. You can find it on just about any podcast platform. So when we think about crises, how many of you think that this world is getting more and more dramatic and traumatic? What do you think? Yeah? I think most of us know that, right? I mean, think about some of these things that we've seen and experienced in the last few years, everything from the fear about global warming to the stock market fluctuations, interest rates, wars and rumors of wars. And you think about Ukraine, Russia, you think about United States, China, Russia, all these different things, all sorts of conflicts. Now, of course, we have Israel and Palestine and all these different things happening. Even when you think about COVID, was COVID a crisis for most people? It was. In fact, the data actually show that more than 50% of Americans found that COVID was the most traumatic experience in their lives. So we're living in a time where we are increasingly subject to stress and trauma. And what it's leaving people to do is to focus very much where? What do you think people do when they're faced with crisis and they've been traumatized over and over again? What it does is it actually leads you into a fight or flight response, which is very self-protective. And it's this state where we basically want to shut the world out from around us. We focus on what's going to keep me safe and my family safe, kind of my tribe, if you will. and we're in survival mode. Now, do you think being in survival mode most of the time is very conducive to health? No, it's actually not. And in fact, the data show that when people are subject to ongoing stress over long periods of time, that it significantly increases the risk of all sorts of health problems. Now, those health problems can include, yes, of course, the psychological ones that you'd expect, right? Like post-traumatic stress disorder if you're subject to long-term stress, and also things like anxiety disorders and depression. But what's really interesting, and researchers have found in recent years, is that long-term ongoing stress, being in that fight or flight state, which again, most of our world is in more and more, actually increases the risk even of physical illness. So things like cardiac disease, diabetes, obesity, and autoimmune diseases and more are all related and at a much higher risk when you've been subjected to ongoing chronic stress. So when I saw this world, or this picture of this world, in this ocean, I was like, wow, this is kind of how I sometimes feel like the world is just on the brink of this we're in the midst of a storm. And so when we think about a crisis, what do you think is needed most during a crisis? What do you think? Anyone have any thoughts on this? What is needed most in a crisis? What's that? Comfort? Yes. Shelter? Yes. Did I hear someone that stays calm? Yeah. Cool, calm, and collected, right? Yes. Well, I was thinking about this, and I really believe that we need people to know how to deal with crises, right? We need a person or people who, in the face of danger, combats adversity through feats of ingenuity, courage, or strength. We need individuals or an individual that performs great deeds or selfless acts for the good of others. Instead of, what was I talking about before? What's the natural tendency when we're dealing with crises? To do what? To self-protect, to think about ourselves, right? But is this actually ideal for our health? No, because we're in that stress mode and we're actually just thinking about ourselves, and this is not what science actually shows is best for ourselves, even though we're thinking about ourselves. We're going to get into this, some of the research on that. What we actually need are people that think about others, that people that aren't going to panic, people that are going to do the right thing even when there is a crisis. In short, what I just gave you right here, is the definition of a hero. So what we need, ladies and gentlemen, is for us to learn how to become heroes. Now, what's really neat is that we can actually study into what makes up a hero. And what's beautiful is that each one of us here this afternoon, as we understand what makes up a hero, can cultivate traits in our own lives that will enable us to be heroes in a time of crisis. So psychologists have actually studied the traits of heroes. And psychologists such as Elaine Kinsella have actually come up with 12 traits of heroes. So we're going to go through these 12 traits, and then we're going to go into talking about 7 virtues that we can cultivate so that these 12 traits can be manifest in our lives. Okay? All right, so what are the 12 traits of heroes? Number 1, brave. So heroes are brave. Number 2, heroes have moral integrity. Number 3, heroes have conviction. They're willing to stand for something that they believe is right. Number 4, heroes are courageous. Number 5, heroes are self-sacrificing. Number 6, heroes are protecting. And as you're looking at this list, think about some heroes that you've seen over the years, whether it's real heroes or even superheroes, these comic heroes, you see a lot of these traits embodied in them, right? And then number 7, honest. Number 8, selfless, which kind of goes along with the self-sacrificing one, right? Number 9, determined. They have that perseverance. Number 10, they save others. Again, there's that focus away from self, and they actually want to look out for the best interests of others. Number 11, inspiring. And finally, number 12, helpful. Okay, so these are the 12 traits of heroes that psychologists have actually studied out, and this is what characterizes a hero. So the question becomes, are you ready to be a hero? Well, what's interesting, there's a reason that I put this picture of a brain up, okay? So when you're not under stress, you can see here this top picture of the brain. What we see there, it says prefrontal regulation during alert, non-stress conditions. So essentially, does anyone know what your frontal lobe does? What is the frontal lobe responsible for? Decision making, yes. What else? Spirituality, what else? Judgment, concentration, thinking, regulating our thoughts, regulating our emotions. So in essence, the frontal lobe of the brain, the part of the brain right here behind my forehead, is the logical part of the brain. So when we are alert, like all of you are, and you're not too stressed, which I hope none of you are overly stressed, guess what's in control? Your frontal lobe is in control. That's a good thing. That means you can have self-control. That means that you can think logically. That means you can rationally manipulate information and come up with good decisions. That means you can focus fairly well, okay? But what happens when you're under stress? So I know it's kind of small, but what does that say? That says amygdala control during stress conditions. So what that actually shows is when we get under stress, what takes over? The amygdala. And what is the amygdala responsible for or involved with? Yes, I heard it over here, emotion. So essentially what takes over when we're stressed out, when we're in a crisis, is our emotions. Does this resonate with anybody? Everything is fine, and then something really unexpected happens. Maybe, let's see, what would be a good unexpected thing to happen? Maybe I was just cool, calm, and collected, and then I dropped something heavy on my foot, and that of course stresses me out. It irritates me. What takes over? The emotions take over, and I yell out, even if I'm maybe in the midst of, I don't know, church or something like that. Suddenly, the emotional part of my brain is in control, right? And so then I might do something or say something that I normally wouldn't do or say. Does that make sense? And so what happens in these scenarios is that if you see there in that brain in the middle, it says emotional habits. So what actually takes over under stress conditions is our natural emotional habits. And so what that means is that, well, let me give you another example. Let's say that I knew that I was going to, that binge eating was terrible for me. And so then I was getting some help, some support, right? And there was some people that were helping me maybe through counseling or group therapy or maybe just some friends holding me accountable. And I was able to quit binge eating for 2 weeks. And I was doing really well because I was checking in with my friends. I was getting that accountability. I was really spending a lot of time doing all the things to bolster my frontal lobe, like exercise and all of these things that will strengthen my brain and help my self-control. But then something really stressful happens. Let's say, for example, I get in a fight with my spouse. Or maybe my pet gets really sick. But something that stresses me out, okay? So what happens then when I'm stressed out? What part of my brain shuts down? The frontal lobe shuts down. So then what part takes over? The amygdala. So in that scenario now, am I likely to continue to be able to control my binge eating? No. Why is that? Because the habit of binge eating is still there, right? I've been using my frontal lobe to change the way that I behave to control that emotional impulse, but because it's only been 2 weeks since I've changed the habit, that habit isn't fully changed. Those pathways in the emotional part of my mind are still there. Does that make sense? And so then when I get under stress, boom, what takes over? The old habit takes over. And this is why when we're trying to change a habit, the most prone time that we are to relapsing into bad behavior is when? When we get stressed. And you can even see this when we get overtired, right? That's a form of stress. And so it's easy to relapse, whether it was smoking or alcohol or binge eating or maybe even negative thinking. Trying to change different habits becomes much more difficult when we're under stress. Now, a lot of people then, they give up and they say, oh man, I'm never going to be able to do this, right? I'm never going to be able to perform well under stress. And that's what we're talking about today. Remember, we're talking about how can I get to that point where I perform well under stress? Well, let me give you another scenario. Look at this picture here. What is this a picture of? Firefighters, right? First responders. Now, our first responders, look at this accident scene. Do you think it would be stressful if you were a first responder and you came onto the scene of this accident? You better believe it, right? Now, are these firefighters still generally able to do the right thing even in the face of huge amounts of stress? Yes. Why is that? What's that? Training. That means that they've practiced doing the right thing over and over and over again. And then when the crisis comes, guess what? They're able to perform well. In fact, research actually shows that when you practice over and over and over again doing the right thing, when stress hits, you can often even perform doing the right action better than under non-stress conditions. Think about basketball players, for example. I mean, some of these people, do some of you remember Michael Jordan? Yeah? Was he a pretty good basketball player? Yeah, and what was amazing about him, of course, he practiced a lot, right? But this guy, he could do things during game time that he was probably never able to do during practice because he had that extra adrenaline and he practiced so much so that when game time came, when that crisis came, he was able to rise to the occasion, not just do the right thing, but do it spectacularly. Isn't that cool? And so what I'm saying here is that if we want to be a hero, what we have to do day to day is cultivate the traits of heroism in our lives, the virtues that we're going to talk about, so that when the crisis comes and our frontal lobe shut down, it's not like we're going to be able to go and be like, okay, wait. What were those 12 traits of heroism? I'm in a crisis. I want to make sure. No, your frontal lobe is not going to be working because you're under stress. But you will be able to rise to the occasion with God's help in the face of crisis if you cultivate these habits a little bit by little bit, day by day. And then when the crisis comes, you're going to be able to do the right thing. Isn't that cool? All right, so how can we become a hero? How to become a hero? Well, I want to underline, heroes are not made overnight. We look at heroes and we think, man, this person was just at the right place at the right time and somehow they just knew how to do the right thing. It's not just a natural that people are heroes. This is the result of years, usually, decades often, of cultivating the right character virtues to become a hero. There's an author he's a psychologist and he's a huge researcher in the area of virtues and positive psychology. And he writes a lot about these virtues and he does a lot of research on this and he writes about how these virtues are really the ones that bring us the greatest happiness. His name is Martin Seligman, and he says, the belief that we can rely on shortcuts to happiness, joy, and comfort, and I would add even heroism, right? Rather than earning these feelings by the exercise of personal strengths and virtues, leads to legions of people who, in the middle of great wealth, are starving spiritually. What he's saying there is that it takes hard work to actually have true happiness, joy, to develop a healthy, positive character. Now, we know as Christians, this hard work, yes, we have our part to play, but we don't have to do it by ourselves. And that's the good news, right? That God wants to cooperate with us in this hard work. These are virtues that the Bible actually teaches, and that when we look at the heroes, for example, of the Bible, that again and again, these individuals, they fell, they made mistakes, but they went back to those virtues that God wanted them to develop, and He helped them develop them. So as we go through these and we talk about these virtues, I don't want you to get discouraged and think, man, I don't know how I'm ever going to get there, because guess what? By ourselves, I don't think any of us will get there. But if we, day by day, even when we make mistakes, we say, you know what? Let me get back up. Let me keep practicing. Let me keep working. You will get there. Don't get discouraged. I mean, think about it this way. If there was a baby, and that baby, when it's learning to walk, it was trying to, taking its first few steps, and it fell over on the ground, right? That's what happens, right? When babies are learning to walk, they fall over. Now, what does that baby do when it falls on the ground? Does it say, oh, I'm such a stupid baby. I should, you know what? I don't think I'm ever going to be able to walk. I might as well just give up right now. Is that what babies do? No, what do? They just get back up and they keep going and they keep practicing, and they don't beat themselves up for mistakes. In the learning process, we're all going to stumble and fall. It takes time. We're going to mess up, but don't let that discourage you. And if you don't remember anything else from what I say, I want you to take home that point. Life is hard, and we got to work hard if we want to become excellent, if we want to really cultivate joy in our lives, healthy relationships, health overall, etc. But don't get discouraged when you mess up. Just get back up. Be like that baby and just like, you know what? I made a mistake. Let me learn from it, but let me just keep going. And pretty soon, you'll get it. You'll get it. All right, so let's talk about the 7 virtues to cultivate so that we can develop these 12 traits of heroism. And these are 7 virtues for happiness and heroism. And so I'm going to give you the overview of the 7. And then we're going to delve into each one of these and some of the research surrounding those. All right, so here we go. Kindness. So this is one major virtue that we need to cultivate. And again, these are things that we need to cultivate on a daily basis. Honesty. We need to be honest with others, yes. But I believe just as importantly, we need to be honest with who else? God and ourselves, right? Yeah. We need to be honest all the way around. Sometimes we lie to ourselves. Sometimes we might even think things that are untrue. One of my favorite sayings that we have a little saying in my office, it's just a little plaque. It says, don't believe everything you think. It's a problem for some of us, right? We really need to look at that, because sometimes our thoughts are so distorted that we can get ourselves into a lot of trouble. And we're like, no, this is what I think, so it must be. Wait a minute, what kind of evidence do we have, right? So being honest with ourselves, being honest with others, being humble, this is huge. We need to learn day by day. What does humility actually look like? And we're going to talk about that. 4th, we need to cultivate perseverance. Perseverance. Don't give up. And I'm going to end with a beautiful story about perseverance. And self-control. Being selfless and thinking about others and doing what's best for other people takes a lot of self-control, doesn't it? Because it's not all about me. And then purpose and hope. When we can find purpose, when we can find hope, even in the midst of suffering and difficulty, This is huge when it comes to becoming a hero and just being a good person and being able to go on. And finally, gratitude. So this is the seventh virtue that we're going to touch on this afternoon. All right, so with kindness, kindness is associated with improved mood, reduced stress, lowered blood pressure, and reduced pain. Acts of kindness can actually release serotonin, dopamine, oxytocin, and endorphins. Perpetually kind people have over 20% less cortisol. So what we see here is that being kind day in, day out lowers our chronic stress level significantly. It also releases these brain chemicals, like I mentioned already, the serotonin, dopamine, oxytocin, endorphins, that will do us just as much good as an antidepressant medication. So acts of kindness can help us tremendously. There was a study that they did on 500 people over 6 weeks, and they had 4 different groups as part of that study. The first group did acts of kindness to the world, like picking up litter and that sort of thing. The second group did acts of kindness to others, to people. The third group did acts of kindness for themselves, right? So in other words, they were doing things like shopping, getting a massage, getting a facial, getting their hair done. Let's see, I'm kind of naming a lot of things for that ladies would be more likely to engage with. What about guys? What kind of stuff would guys, acts of kindness for guys? Maybe going out and, I guess, yeah, shopping, right? Buying themselves a chainsaw or something like that. What else do guys like to do to treat themselves? Golf, there you go. Thank you. Yes. So that was the third group. And then the fourth group was just the control group. So they weren't any more or less kind than they usually were. Okay. So they tracked their moods before and after the interventions. And they found that the first 2 groups, the ones that did acts of kindness for not for themselves, but for the world and for other people, had a significant improvement in mood, while the other groups remained the same. That's an interesting study, isn't it? Now, does that mean that you can never go and treat yourself to a round of golf or, getting your hair done or whatever, shopping, this or that? No, that's not what I'm trying to say. But the results are interesting, aren't they? The results show us there's a significant improvement when we do kind things to others. And Jesus himself, what did he say? It is better to what? Give than to receive, isn't it? And studies actually show that. There's other studies as well that show that altruism, in other words, when we're doing kind acts for other people, improves health, mental and physical health, more than when we receive kindness from other people. And then what about gossip? Now, gossip is actually something that can be very unkind. And unfortunately, gossip is something that even, in circles where we're like, hey, we're trying to be Christians or we're trying to be really good people, that this can take place. Well, what is gossip? Gossip is one of the most common habits that prevents us from practicing kindness. It involves speaking negatively about another person or speaking about their private lives for selfish reasons. So in other words, we're just talking about them, we're criticizing them, we're spreading even maybe truths, but there's no real purpose talking about those things except that it's interesting tidbits of information. And I like to just talk about those because it's entertainment in a way, okay? Now, some gossip is very malicious and people are actually trying to hurt other people. But some, we would almost say, on the surface at least, is kind of like innocent almost. It's like, I'm not really trying to hurt them, but this is just interesting. But it can be very unkind because it can hurt other people, especially when it's not such flattering information. So I do want to point out that this is different than constructive sharing for the sake of helping someone, seeking necessary support, or resolving a conflict. So there are times to talk about other people behind their back, but only when there's a purpose, and only when that purpose is constructive and not destructive. Does that make sense? So we have to be very careful. And I want to encourage each one of us, when we're thinking about being more kind, when we're talking about somebody else, what's the purpose of what I'm talking about right now? Why am I talking about them? Is this, and even if it's like, oh, because I care about them, well, is this really, this conversation, is there something really good that could come out of it to help them? Okay? So we really want to be careful about that. But if it is, if we're talking about them because we really are involved in their lives and there is something that needs to be done and there is some way that we can help them, then yes, we should be talking about it. We should be praying about it. We should be trying to work towards resolution. Gossip distorts our perception of others, which damages our relationships. All right, so let's go on to our next virtue, which is honesty. Adults who score high in honesty and integrity have lower rates of depression. Research participants who stopped lying for 10 weeks experienced significant improvements in relationships and mental health. Now, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but aren't some of you happy that you're not habitual liars to begin with? That's a good thing, right? And if some of you have an issue with lying, then you can work on that. We all have things that we need to work on. And the good news is here that your mental health will improve in the process. Being honest builds trust and protects relationships. Honesty involves telling the truth in our words and in our thoughts. And like I said before, we want to be honest, not just about when we're talking with other people, but also when we're talking to ourselves. And sometimes, we just have to say, God, help me to see the truth, because it can be very easy. We all have a distorted view of reality. Some of our view is more distorted than others. But when we're humble and we say, God, help me to see what is truth and help me to actually, speak that to myself and others, then it will be much more easy to see that. Research has linked telling lies to an increased risk of cancer, increased risk of obesity, anxiety, depression, addiction, gambling, poor work satisfaction, and poor relationships. And that's from Dr. Lee Fitzgerald, psychologist. What actually happens in the brain when people are lying is that the brain becomes desensitized to lying over time. At first, when people lie, the amygdala, remember that's part of the emotional part of your brain, lights up and is very active. And as the person continues to tell the lie, the amygdala becomes less and less active. So essentially what happens, and have any of you ever noticed this? I don't know if, again, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but maybe when you're a kid, or maybe you know some kids, or you know some other people, at first, it's very nerve-wracking. It's like, oh, am I going to be found out? Are they going to know? And they're almost like shaking in their boots. But pretty soon, after it becomes habitual, it's like they can just stare you straight in the face, not blink an eye. It's like, wow, they're lying. They're lying. It's amazing, and it's kind of scary. This makes it easier to lie again and to tell even bigger lies. In Luke 16:10, it says, whoever is dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with much. So again, we want to practice the day-to-day honesty so that when the crises come, we can be honest and truthful. Humility. Humility is the ability to have an accurate perception of ourselves, both our strengths and our weaknesses. Sometimes we think of humility as kind of like this groveling sort of thing, like, oh, I'm such a terrible person. I'm going to kind of like just walk around with my head down, and I'm not really even worth much at all, and this sort of thing. But in reality, humility is having an accurate perception of ourselves. In other words, it's knowing our strengths and our weaknesses. So it has to do actually with being honest with ourselves. It isn't about self-loathing, indecision, or weakness. For many centuries, humility was considered to be an admirable virtue. However, this has changed in Western culture, in part due to a misunderstanding of self-esteem. Starting in the 1970s, there was an influential movement within psychology to improve people's self-esteem. And Nathaniel Branden wrote a book called The Psychology of Self-Esteem. And Nathaniel Branden said, I cannot think of a single psychological problem, from anxiety and depression to fear of intimacy or of success to spouse battery or child molestation, that is not traced back to the problem of low self-esteem. Now, I think it's important to have a balance here, because what we find is that, yes, healthy self-worth is important. But what we've seen is that the pendulum has swung to the opposite extreme, and people are just all about, oh, you have to have this really high self-esteem to be happy. But where does the focus go when we're just focusing on self-esteem? On me. And do you think ultimately that's going to bring us the greatest happiness? No. And in fact, what's one of the most common topics that people talk about in psychology today? You hear a lot about it just in the general. What's that? Self-care, yeah, but it's a disorder. What's a very common disorder that a lot of people talk about? It's actually a personality disorder. Narcissism, yes. So I believe a lot of what we're experiencing, this huge explosion of narcissism, or people that are, I would say, on the narcissistic spectrum, had its roots in this self-esteem movement that started back in the 60s and 70s. And so even though it is a healthy sense of self-worth is important, Branden was wrong to think that low self-esteem or high self-esteem would solve all the problems. And so, the example of many narcissists or even people that commit crimes, some of these people actually have very high self-esteem. They think very highly of themselves. They're very proud. But that doesn't help their mental health, and it certainly doesn't help their relationships. Now, Peterson and Seligman, in their book, Character, Strengths, and Virtues, remember Martin Seligman was that guy I showed you earlier, they say, in the guise of self-esteem, modern Western culture encourages the pursuit of pride. Society's eagerness to facilitate positive views of the self at all costs has created a dangerous imbalance. By focusing attention on the benefits of positive views of self, we can easily overlook the dangers. Pride. It's important to have a healthy sense of self-worth, but pride is different from self-worth. Pride results in feeling better than others, refusing to apologize or accept feedback, basing our value on performance or external validation, and it leads to damaged relationships. Humility, on the other hand, can protect us from the damaging effects of pride. So let's compare and contrast pride versus humility a little bit here. So pride, and you can ask yourself, how proud am I, by looking at these traits and saying, okay, am I defensive? If someone comes to me with a concern, for example, do I get defensive, or am I open? Am I open to that feedback? Am I opening to listening? That would be the humble approach. And then pride goes along with arrogance, whereas humility is teachable. Pride tends to blame and to finger point and say, oh, that's not my fault, that's someone else's fault. Humility takes accountability. Pride is entitled. Humility is grateful. In other words, I deserve that anyway. And humility is just grateful for whatever they receive. Pride is perfectionistic. Humility is realistic. And pride is self-centered, and humility is other-centered. Research actually shows a lot of benefits of humility, and I have a whole lecture just on humility. It's just such an amazing, beautiful topic, actually. But people that are humble are seen to be more likable. They have better long-term relationships. They're more generous and helpful. They're able to receive help more easily. When we're in that proud state of mind, where it's like, no, I'm good. I don't need your help. I'll do this myself, right? People that are humble are more open to receive help. They have higher self-worth, which is interesting, right? So again, because humility has to do with an accurate perception of ourselves. It's saying my value is not based on my performance, it's based on who I am. It's based on, yes, I have faults, but that doesn't mean I'm somehow a worthless person. It just means I have things to learn, etc. They tend to be more forgiving because they realize, like, hey, I make mistakes, and so others make mistakes too, and I can more easily forgive that. They have better recovery from trauma. They do better academically. They're better able to achieve their goals because they're more realistic with their goals. They're more grateful and content. They actually tend to be more spiritual. They have more peaceful deaths, which is interesting. So people that are more humble actually die better. They die more peacefully. They're not saying, oh, because let me put it this way, a lot of times pride goes along with this sense of I have to be in control all the time. People that are humble, it's more easy for them to relinquish control. Overall, better physical and psychological well-being. So just a couple of 3 things, ways to cultivate humility in our day-to-day. We can cultivate humility by listening to others, and just being, again, open. By looking around us and seeing the blessings around us and being grateful for those. I have that picture of somebody looking at a sunset, for example. When we look out, just last night I was walking and I was looking up at the night sky and I saw the beautiful moon and the stars coming out, and I just felt so small in a way, but at the same time so grateful, just realizing that God had created all of this. Those sorts of experiences, as we look around ourselves, as we listen, they will create humility. And then again, the learning, right? Just being open to saying, I don't have it all figured out. What can I learn from you? And it's amazing because I learn things every day. I learn things from my children all the time, even though who knows more? Hopefully I know more, right, by now. But the point being, we can learn so much. We can learn from our animals. We can learn. Solomon, the wisest man, what did he say? He said, go to the ant. He learned from insects, right? So there's this humility will teach us so much when we have that openness to learn. All right, our next virtue to cultivate to become a hero in a time of crisis is perseverance. Perseverance involves pushing through a goal or difficult experience even when you want to quit. Perseverance builds resilience, confidence, and problem-solving skills. And this is an amazing story. Amputee Jackie Hunt Borsma broke the world record by running what? 104 marathons in 104 days straight. Isn't that amazing? Her motto was, I can do hard things. I can do hard things. And did she do something hard? Oh yeah, you better believe it. But that took day in, day out training beforehand, and then perseverance for nearly half a year. Well, I guess you say nearly a third of a year, to run over 100 marathons in 104 days. Phenomenal. We need to remind ourselves that we too can do hard things. Don't give up. Don't give up. Self-control helps us avoid bad choices. It involves saying no to harmful things and not overusing helpful things. Self-control is associated with enhanced mental and physical health, improved relationships, and increased productivity. We need self-control in eating, drinking, working, media use, managing our emotions, relating to others, etc. Self-control involves believing that we can choose to reject our impulsive desires. So, again, when we get into that mode of crisis, remember, what part of the brain shuts down when we're under stress? The frontal lobe. So, when we have stress, do we have a lot of self-control? It's kind of a trick question, right? The truth is, no, we actually don't have a lot of self-control because the frontal lobe has to do with self-control. But can we exhibit traits of self-control under stress? Yes. Why is that? Because if we've practiced self-control in the day-to-day, the little things of life, then when we're under periods of stress, we can again still do the right thing because our mind has been trained to still practice self-control. Does that make sense? Okay. So it's one of these things that the little day-to-day choices have a huge effect on our character. And our character is revealed in the moment of crisis. And I'll tell you, one of the biggest things I think that's supplanting and getting in the way of us developing healthy self-control day to day is something that I hold right here in my pocket. Does anyone have one of these? Yeah. Research actually shows that media, entertainment media, our cell phones specifically, is one of the easiest ways for us to suffer a lack of self-control because it impairs our frontal lobe function when we are overusing media. When we are constantly being interrupted and distracted by these devices, what that does is it impairs our ability to focus, and we're constantly being torn from one place to the next and distracted and this and that our frontal lobe starts to actually get confused, and we cannot think clearly, and we cannot practice self-control and focus, etc. So that's kind of just, and again, there's so much more we could say about media, but it's just something to keep in mind when we're trying to practice these virtues. Media can actually get in the way. Besides, it can also get in the way of our focus on selflessness and kindness to others too, right? Because where do we tend to focus? I mean, I've even had times where I've been like kind of trying to walk and do something while I'm looking at my phone, like run into something or someone, right? I mean, it just puts us in our own world. It's ridiculous. All right. Purpose and hope. Hope is the anticipation and expectation that at least some things will go well in the future. Hopefulness is associated with improved emotional coping. Hope enhances immune function. A sense of hope and defined purpose for living decreases the risk of suicide. Have any of you ever heard of Viktor Frankl? So Viktor Frankl was a psychiatrist, and he was a Jewish psychiatrist, and he was alive during World War II. Well, he got put into one of these concentration camps. And during his time there, he struggled a lot, obviously, like all the people in the concentration camps. But what he decided, see, at the time, there was only two main schools of psychotherapy. There was the Freudian, like blame everything on kind of your parents and, you know, this weird like id and ego and all of this stuff and your sexual confusion. This was kind of like one of the schools of psychology, right? The other one was the whole Watkins, Skinner, and Pavlov, where it was basically stimulus and response, like Pavlov's dog, right? The stimulus being the bell, the dog salivate, and then, so basically you're a product of your environment in a way. And so Viktor Frankl, as he was in the concentration camp, he didn't buy into Freudian psychology, but he also didn't like this stimulus and response sort of idea because he said, you know what? This is depressing because the stimulus here, what's the stimulus when you're in a concentration camp? It's abuse, right? I mean, the tyranny, it's being beaten, it's being starved to death, half to death, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's the stimulus. Well, what's the natural response going to be to that? What do you think? It's going to be anxiety, going to be depression, hatred, bitterness, desire for revenge. Do you think that's good for your mental health? No. So what Frankl actually decided is he said, you know what? I want to figure out a way to overcome this and to do this thing differently. And so what Frankl actually said is, I want to try to find some meaning even in the midst of my suffering. And he ended up writing a book called Man's Search for Meaning. And he said that we can endure anything if we can find meaning even in the midst of suffering. And I love that. And that goes so far. And, when we can find meaning, even in the difficult things of our daily lives, and we can say, I don't understand exactly why, but I can see and I believe that somehow good can come out of this, that can help us so much with our mental health. It helps us to cultivate the character virtues that we're cultivating for true mental health heroism. All right. In 2005, National Geographic identified 3 groups of people that lived the longest: Okinawans in Japan, Sardinians in Italy, and Seventh-day Adventists in Loma Linda. Now, of course, since then, they've identified other, what we call now, blue zones, right? But these were the first 3. One factor associated with a longer life was having a strong sense of purpose. Okinawans know their ikigai. And ikigai, and forgive me if you know Japanese because I'm sure I'm mispronouncing it, is a reason for living, a purpose for getting out of bed in the morning. So again, what is your purpose? How can we find meaning even in the midst of difficulty? And our final virtue that I wanted to mention is gratitude. And I love this quote, and there's so much we could say about gratitude, but this quote is beautiful from Cicero, the Roman philosopher. He says, gratitude is not just the greatest of all virtues, but the parent of all the others. Because when we practice habitual gratitude, when we practice looking for the good, even in difficult situations, this can give us purpose. When we practice gratitude, this will foster, a sense of kindness. It will actually make us want to persevere. It will make us humble, like we already talked about before. It will actually give us more purpose and hope and self-control. So, as we wrap up our time this afternoon, I wanted to share a story with you about an unlikely hero. Has anyone heard the name Desmond Doss before? This is a picture of Desmond Doss. Now, Desmond Doss was an unlikely hero. But as we go along, you're going to see how early in his life he cultivated these virtues, and therefore God was able to put him in a place where he was able to become one of the greatest heroes, I believe, of all time. He was born February 7, 1919, and he was raised in a Seventh-day Adventist home in Virginia. His mother was a strong Christian, but his father, who had served in World War I, had significant PTSD. And as a result, his father, he actually battled with depression and alcoholism. So we see his home was not without difficulty. He learned early in life the importance of trusting the Bible as the word and the perfect will of God Almighty. On the wall of the living room of his home hung a picture of the 10 Commandments. And along each of the 10 Commandments, there was a picture that depicted each one of those 10 Commandments. Well, he would often go as a little boy, and he would scoot one of the chairs into the living room when no one else was home, because he wasn't actually supposed to do this, but he was so drawn to the 10 Commandments that he would get that chair up against the wall, and he would get up to the 10 Commandments, and he would look at those pictures. And what he saw right at the 6th commandment especially struck him. Does anyone know what is the 6th commandment? Thou shalt not kill. What he saw there in the 6th commandment was a picture of bloody Abel lying on the ground with murderous Cain with a knife in his hand standing above him. Little Desmond could not understand how in the world could a brother kill a brother. He had a brother who was 2 years younger than him. His name was Harold, and he could not imagine wanting to hurt him. They were like best buds, and that just struck him to the core. Desmond loved playing baseball, but when he was 8 years old, he fell and cut his hand on a broken bottle. The jagged glass sliced through his palm of his hand, and he went to the family doctor, and the doctor looked at it and shook his head sadly. "You'll never be able to use this hand again, Desmond," he said. Desmond's mother did not give up so easily. When the cut was healed, she began massaging his injured hand, and she would move his fingers. With her help and encouragement, he regained the use of his fingers. But he remained disabled and was no longer able to participate in any sports that required using both hands. Now, can you imagine being an 8-year-old boy and you're, in a town where like baseball is like everything, right? And now suddenly you can't even play. How discouraging, how disheartening. At first he was crushed, but as the days went on, he found that there were other things that he could do besides play games. And I love that, right? Because even as a young boy, he said, you know what? When bad things happen to me, instead of getting in this mode of just feeling sorry for myself, I'm going to find other ways to actually bring good out of this. And so we can even see early on this heroism that was already starting to be cultivated. So he did more than his share of household chores. His mother loved flowers, and he would work with her creating beauty in nature. And they ended up having so many flowers that they started sharing them with others that were less fortunate. At first, they gave flowers to their neighbors, especially when someone was sick. And then they started to take flowers to the hospital and even to the city jail. One patient who had no friends or relatives left in the world was dying of an incurable disease, and he was just suffering in so much pain. And Desmond was moved with compassion, and he sat with that dying man until he died, actually, in the hospital. And again, this is as a young boy, and he sat with him because he could not leave his side. He had so much compassion, and he was, of course, sad. It struck him in a huge way, but he was so grateful that at least this man didn't have to die alone. He learned early on that even in unhappy situations, he could be a blessing by doing the best he could to help a fellow human being. Another time, there was a woman, formerly a church member, who desperately required a blood transfusion. Desmond, along with several other members of the congregation, hurried to the hospital. It was only Desmond's blood which matched the woman's. He was only a skinny boy in his early teens, but the patient's condition was critical, and he offered his blood without hesitation. After giving it, he got off the table on which he had been lying and had to grab a hat rack just to keep him from falling to the floor. The woman pulled through. She and her husband asked Desmond to come see them, and they wanted to give him money, and he refused the money. And then so they said, well, can we give you some kind of gift? And he said, yes, you can give me a present, he said. Come to church. And they did, and they became active, dedicated members of the congregation. Desmond wanted to do his patriotic duty to support his country during World War II. Despite his family's objections, he enlisted in the Army and entered military service on April 1st, 1942. He entered as a conscientious objector due to his religious convictions. Remember, he said, I could never kill somebody. I could never bear a rifle, a killing instrument, into combat. So he was trained as a medic so that he did not need to carry a weapon. Now, his religious convictions, along with his slight stature and shyness, made many soldiers believe he would be a major liability in battle. Despite his desire to serve his country with all his heart, he was subjected to psychological and physical abuse by his fellow soldiers. Name-calling, shoe-throwing, kicking, threats of being shot in battle were all commonplace due to his steadfast adherence to his conviction to not carry any weapons, his simple and pure speech, his humble demeanor, and his refusal to work on Sabbath. He even endured several attempts by his superiors to have him discharged from the military. Well, he entered into the Pacific Theater into combat. And he was actually, first in the Philippines and in, where was the other place? Guam. But Private Desmond Doss walked into the bloodiest battle of World War II's Pacific Theater, which was Okinawa Battle, with nothing to protect himself except his Bible and his faith in God. The fighting took place on the hellish Maida Escarpment in April 1945. The battlefield, located on top of a sheer 400-foot cliff, was fortified with a deadly network of Japanese machine gun nests and booby traps. The escarpment, nicknamed Hacksaw Ridge for the treacherously steep cliff, was key to winning the Battle of Okinawa. The mission was thought to be near impossible, and when Doss's battalion was ordered to retreat, the medic did what? The medic refused to leave his fallen comrades behind. The danger was even greater for Doss because the Japanese were known to often target medics. He was basically giving himself up to die. Facing heavy machine gun and artillery fire, Doss repeatedly ran alone into the kill zone, carrying wounded soldiers to the edge of the cliff and single-handedly lowering them down to safety. Each time he saved a man's life, Doss prayed out loud, "Lord, please give me just one more. Just one more." By the end of the night, in the span of about 12 hours, he had rescued an estimated 75 men. The always modest Doss reckoned he saved about 50, but his fellow soldiers gauged it closer to 100, so they decided to split the difference. You can see that humility, right? He ended up serving for 2 more weeks after this battle before being wounded by shrapnel from a grenade. And by the way, that grenade, he was trying to kick it out of the way so it wouldn't injure other people. Despite his injuries, he continued to treat other soldiers until his arm was broken by Japanese fire. President Harry Truman, here you see, presented Doss with the Medal of Honor on October 12, 1945. He was the first conscientious objector to receive the honor. And this just blows me away when I think about it. Out of more than 3,500 heroic individuals to be awarded the Medal of Honor for above and beyond the call of duty, only his citation reads, "far above and beyond the call of duty." Isn't that phenomenal? He spent the first 5 years after the war recovering from his injuries and ultimately lost a lung to tuberculosis. His injuries prevented him from working full-time, and he devoted the rest of his life to working with his church. Growing up as Doss's son, Desmond Jr. says that he heard the tale of his father's heroics many times. Despite knowing the story's facts, Desmond Jr. says he does recall asking his father a personal question about that night. "What on earth were you thinking?" he asked his father. And I never really got the answer I was looking for. Even at a very private, intimate level, he just wanted to give all the glory to God and never seemed to acknowledge his own role. Desmond did not set out to be a hero, but his early life training, especially in kindness, humility, perseverance, self-control, and purpose, and giving glory to God, gratitude, right? Prepared him to be a hero when the crisis arose. He was able to lay hold of his faith in God, and supernatural results followed. We are in the midst of a spiritual battle. We are in the midst of a crisis right now, and I'm not trying to be a fearmonger, but I'm just trying to be realistic, realizing this world, it's crazy, and it's getting crazier and crazier. There's so much stress. Like Desmond, each one of us can make a huge difference in those people around us, in their lives. This starts with the little everyday opportunities in our lives. By daily cultivating the virtues of kindness, honesty, humility, perseverance, self-control, purpose, and hope, along with gratitude, in the everyday little things of life, we can be a blessing to the world, and we can be even happier ourselves than we imagined. Desmond prayed. What was his prayer? Does anyone remember? Lord, help me get just one more. This was his motivation to face discomfort, danger, and pain. And I want to ask you, are you willing to look at these 7 virtues that we've talked about this afternoon? Are you willing to cultivate those in your own life? Are you willing to say, God, help me in the little things of life, the little annoyances, the things that are not so easy to deal with? Help me to cultivate those things so that when we reach stress, God will be able to also use us in a mighty way to be a blessing to others. But again, the blessings, the way that we can bless others, that starts today, in the here and now. We can bless people in so many amazing ways, just in the little things of life, and we don't have to wait until that crisis. So I hope that this prayer of Desmond Doss, Lord, help me to just see the need around me, help me to get just one more, will become our own. And as we do that, we will truly enter into a higher state of mental health than we ever imagined possible. And by the way, and Darren, I think, is going to mention this too, this is a beautiful, of course, they made it into a movie, but we also have an amazing little book that we can also read and learn more about the story, the life, and the faith of Desmond Doss. Thank you very much.